numbers. Anonymization makes Keyservers trustworthy.
So it might seem like you're going to have a moment of escape from Tor for a minute, but I'll get to it soon. So I'm interested in key distribution. And one of the problems is that we've suddenly got lots of end-to-end encrypted instant messaging systems. PGP's been around for a long time, but there's a lot of centralized key servers, and it means that essentially the problem of trying to verify identity is fobbed off to users to do themselves, which they don't. So what I'm interested in is, can we then audit the key servers? Can we audit these central servers so that they become trustworthy in some sense? Because if I've put my public key into the Signal key server, it should always be responding the same way if someone asks for my key. So the question is, how can we detect this kind of inconsistent response? Now, to go with an analogy that's just with people rather than machines, imagine you're owning a shop and you think that someone at your information desk is breaking the rules somehow and giving people false information and sending them somewhere strange. You can have a look while you're in to see what people are doing, but you've got no idea what they do when you go home. So what you do is you send someone else in disguise, or you can put on your false moustache and go into the shop and see what they do. Go and ask yourself and see if you get the kind of response that you should be expecting. And the idea is that by remaining anonymous, you know that there's no special treatment going on. And that's the basis of the technique that we're looking at here, which is that essentially the machine needs to remain anonymous. It's not about the anonymity of a person. You don't need that to protect their privacy. They're not perhaps expecting any particular privacy. But it does make sense sometimes for another part of the system to maintain its anonymity. Now, there have been a few systems that do something like this that have been proposed before. The one I sort of show here is Double Check, which is a system to try to detect local man-in-the-middle attacks, because the idea is that you connect to your normal server, look at the certificate that you get, then make another connection via Tor. And this part here, where you connect to Tor, it's protected. And so you're getting two viewpoints of that server. And if you get a different certificate via Tor and via the direct path, then there's either a man-in-the-middle attack sort of near you, or there's one on the Tor network. But these just look at man-in-the-middle attacks that have been shown so far. And there are a couple down here, some examples of that. But they just look at man-in-the-middle attacks. And what I'm interested in is equivocation, because you might have a compromised server that it might say, well, yeah, you know what the result should be, so I'm going to give you the real one. But everyone else, they've got no idea what it's meant to be, so I can send them whatever they want and they'll never know better. So we used an anonymizing system, and in our initial analysis we've used a mixed net to analyze this. And the idea is essentially that an adversary can connect the messages to who got them with a relatively small probability of 1 on n factorial. I won't belabor the combinatorial stuff. We have actually gone through and done a proper sort of game-based definition of what we're using for our adversary model. But the basic idea is that we have an adversary who is, say, the key server, or someone who is man in the middle of the key server, and they can talk to this set of users through a mixed net. So they can say whatever they want, but when they say something, it just goes to one of the random users who is connected. And yeah, we can model this using bijections and random selection. And if you want to get more rigorous, then you can look at what happens when that anonymity system is imperfect and everything sort of gets multiplied by a constant-ish factor. But for the moment, I'll just talk about, let's say we've got a perfect mixed net. So how do we do this? We have our verification protocol, which is basically You make a request anonymously again and again and again. You do it M times. And if you get a consistent set of responses, great. We'll accept whatever value we've gotten. If not, then you know that something's wrong, because the server should always be responding the same way. And if suddenly it tells you different things, then you know that it's not behaving consistently. So something's gone wrong and you should probably report it publicly. And ideally, you can use signatures in the responses, so that then this means you actually have a proof that something's gone wrong. So a graphical representation of what this means is that you've got these clients here that are talking to this sort of central key server, say, through an anonymizer. So, as I sort of said before, the key server doesn't have any direct access to the clients, doesn't have the ability to target anyone. And so they'll just get these randomly chosen responses from the server. And you know, if the attacker is really lucky, one of them will get lots of consistent results. They'll ping, 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 and the responses will all be the same, despite the fact that they've sent lots of different messages back. And so one client might accept this, another one might have been unlucky and gotten a consistent but different result from the central service and accept this one. But everyone else, they can see that, well, the responses aren't consistent, something's wrong, I'm not going to proceed. And the nice thing about using a mixed net, and which is why we've done this initially, and this has some problems in practice, which we'll talk about a bit later, but the idea is that then you can do lots of pulling bulls from urns analysis. So for example, suppose you're an attacker, you know that Alice and Bob are connecting to you, and you want Alice to receive one result and Bob to receive another. So essentially you've got an urn with maybe 2 bulls, maybe more. Some of them are white, some of them are black, and you want Alice to pull out a black bull and Bob a white one. And if they don't do that, then you've failed. And so we can bound the probability that an attacker will achieve this. So this is the probability that a particular pair of users will be deceived in a particular way. And this is kind of how things work if you have, say, a PGP key server and you're accessing it using this kind of technique. But when you use things like Connix or whatever, where you've got this Merkle trio that everyone uses, so everyone's trying to agree on this one piece of data, then you know you've got lots of users and everyone has to get the same result. And because there's sort of one true value and everyone knows whether or not it's broken, basically, then one of the things that you can look for is, well, what is the probability that we get away with this as an attacker? Because if I'm running, say, the Signal key server, or I'm running some major Connix installation at some company, this is obviously bad for my reputation if I'm seen to be lying to people. And so I really want to be absolutely certain that I don't get caught by anyone, even if it means that, well, maybe I get away with it with certain people, maybe I successfully deceive certain people, but everyone else has noticed what I'm doing and I've got people banging on my door. It's not really what I want. Well, in this case, the probability of success is even lower, because it's no longer just a couple of people that I have to deceive. I have to deceive everyone. And with the number of users n, this rapidly falls, and again, it falls exponentially as time goes on, where m is like the number of times you've done this protocol. And we can do more bounds where, well, there's an order to connecting, and for example, I know what my public key is, so I'm making these connections and I'm checking each time whether my public key is correct in the system. I won't belabor this, this is just the probability bounds. You can see what's exponential in what. So to look at some practical numbers for how you might do this, if you try to integrate this with, say, a PGP implementation, you can connect to a key server and look up individual users. But you can't look up every user, because there's no way that you can just download all of them easily. So you have to decide, well, I want to talk to this user, I'm going to carry out some verification. And you need this to be quick, because if you want to do this, this is sort of delaying, this is a time delay between when you've decided to talk to someone and when you can actually make that communication. So in this example, we're just going to look at, say, 5-minute intervals. So we're making these requests every 5 minutes. So each user has to do that for their own keys, and each user also does that for users that they want to verify. So this causes quite a lot of load, and maybe this isn't a terribly practical way to do it, but it is feasible, and this is what we've implemented in our test. But what you can see is that with this kind of parameters, it's not implausible to get quite a high level of confidence that you're not being deceived, or at least a high level of confidence that you would catch the key server if it were trying to give different results. So on the order of a few hours to get to really very small probabilities. Now, things like certificate transparency, where you have lots, like really, really large numbers of users using it, then you can get very good bounds here. It doesn't take very long when you've got 100 million users and you want none of them to find out that something's going wrong. It doesn't take very long before you're quite certain that this would be hard. And again, the numbers we used here, they're just coming from Chrome's sort of auto-update functionality. In reality, it's unlikely that Chrome is going to suddenly start using a mixnet or something to connect to their auto-update software, but this gives an idea of how you might go about doing it. Now, for a directory system for key distribution that's something like Connex, for example, this is a bit interesting because you've got a relatively large number of users, but unless you've got really widespread sort of software involved, you're going to have less than certificate transparency, because something like that, if it were implemented in Chrome, you've got probably 1 billion or 2 users using it. Whereas in our analysis here, we've just said, well, imagine everyone in the PGP strong set suddenly started using some Connex implementation. Now, because everything's in a Merkle tree and sort of linked back in the past, you don't need to check every user every time, because you've already got a copy of the whole directory. And you can say, well, I've got this directory. I know no one's complained about it, so I can just look up the user in there, in that past directory that I've already seen. And so we can have things go a little bit slower. In this case, in the graph, we've used sort of every 30 minutes because you'd want changes in keys to propagate relatively quickly as well. And we've done an implementation. It's not particularly good. It uses N cursors, so I think that's an indication of the level of maturity we're talking about here, but it shows that you can implement it in a reasonably practical way. But going back to what I said about mixnets, they're not the most widespread form of anonymity system out there at the moment. Tor is really easily available, and that's what we used in our demonstration. But the problem is that it's then susceptible to traffic analysis. Now, there are correlation attacks which you can't really deal with so easily, but one of the important things is if you just make a request to a server through Tor every 10 minutes, well, any attacker that's paying attention will notice, well, this guy's clock is 2 minutes slow, this guy's clock is 2 minutes fast, and this guy's clock is right on time, and we'll just say, well, look at the requests that come 10 minutes apart. They're obviously the same person. So you have to add some randomization, and in our sort of expanded paper, we explain a bit how we've done this. But the idea is basically you set a time window and you say, well, everyone makes a request at a random time in that window. But this isn't really ideal, and one of the things that we'd like to do is find a proper asynchronous protocol, because Tor is inherently asynchronous, unlike a mixnet, and so it would be better if we had a protocol that was more well-suited and didn't need to do sort of funny timing things to avoid attacks. The other thing is that there's this trade-off between legacy support and the ability to sort of do things in an efficient way. Because once you've got a sort of hash-linked Merkle tree or a temporally linked Merkle tree, then you can do this really efficiently because you don't need to look up every individual person. But the problem is the existing key server network, the existing key server network doesn't do this, and it probably never will, in the near future at least. But the question is it actually technically possible to have this kind of distributed network where it's all volunteer run, but still doing something kind of connexy? And I've also just sidestepped the whole issue here of how do you report when errors have occurred, or when a server appears to be lying, or that kind of thing. It's not immediately clear what is the best way to do that. There are lots of ways that you could do it, and they have varying trade-offs. Certificate transparency has monitors that keep an eye on things, and maybe we could do something like that, but this is something I'd be interested in hearing opinions of. But the obvious thing is, well, does this actually sound like a usable approach to people? I'd be interested in any comments you'd have on the sort of idea. Thanks.